In the heart of America's violent prison system, where concrete walls hold the ghosts of broken men and the clang of steel doors marks the rhythm of life and death, Wendell "Blue" Norris carved his place among the most feared. His name carried a weight that resonated through the cell blocks of California's toughest institutions, a name spoken with a mix of awe and dread. To those who served beside him in the Aryan Brotherhood, he was both a brother and a warning, a man so devoted to the gang's brutal code that his loyalty bordered on madness. The story of Wendell Norris begins not in any particular neighborhood or family, but in the furnace of the California prison system itself, a place that forged monsters and martyrs alike. The late 1970s and early 1980s were the defining years of the Brotherhood's rise. California's overcrowded prisons had become battlegrounds where racial divisions dictated survival. The Black Guerrilla family, Nuestra Familia, and Mexican Mafia all controlled their racial territories with lethal precision. For white inmates, the Aryan Brotherhood was both a shield and a noose. Its members offered protection to those who pledged their loyalty, but betrayal or weakness was punished with death. It was in this merciless world that Norris came of age. Little is known about his life before incarceration, perhaps because in the story that would follow, the man he was before prison didn't matter. Inside, identity was rewritten. Inmates became soldiers, and life was reduced to codes, debts, and blood oaths. Wendell Norris embraced that transformation completely. He wasn't simply surviving, he was evolving into something darker, more dangerous, and far more disciplined. His intelligence set him apart, but it was his fearlessness that elevated him through the Brotherhood's ranks. He earned the name Blue early on. Some said it came from his piercing eyes, cold and unblinking like the color of ice. Others said it referred to the blue-tinged tattoos that covered his arms and chest, symbols of violence and allegiance etched into his skin with crude, handmade needles. Whatever the origin, blue fit him perfectly. He was distant, unpredictable, and merciless when crossed. To the Aryan Brotherhood, he was the embodiment of the organization's creed: blood in, blood out. By the early 1980s, Norris had become a known quantity within the walls of California's Folsom and San Quentin prisons. He wasn't merely another foot soldier in the white prison hierarchy. He was a figure of growing influence. He understood that in the Brotherhood, power didn't come from talk, but from action. Every act of violence, every order given, and every show of defiance against guards or rivals was a message, a declaration of dominance. Norris's reputation grew because he refused to show fear, even when facing death. What made him especially dangerous was his ability to combine cold calculation with explosive brutality. He wasn't just violent for the sake of it. He used violence strategically as a way to control those around him. He could plan an attack with surgical precision one moment and explode into chaos the next. That duality made him unpredictable and therefore powerful. Prison officials would later describe him as one of the most uncontrollable inmates in the California system, not because he lacked discipline, but because his discipline was rooted in insanity. For Norris, prison was not a punishment, it was a kingdom. Each yard, each cell block, and each racial territory was a field of warfare where reputation determined survival. He believed in the Brotherhood's mission of racial supremacy, but even more than that, he believed in the cult of loyalty. To him, the AB wasn't just a gang, it was family, religion, and identity all in one. And within that belief system, betrayal was the ultimate sin. By the time he was in his 30s, Wendell "Blue" Norris had developed a mythos around his name. He was the type of man other inmates either gravitated toward or avoided entirely. His cold charisma drew younger white inmates into the Brotherhood's orbit, while his savagery kept even his own peers cautious in his presence. Correctional officers whispered about him in briefings. Wardens marked his file with red flags. They knew that wherever Blue was housed, trouble would follow. But beneath that outward control, there was a restlessness, a storm that never stopped churning. Norris was addicted to conflict. He thrived on tension and danger, on pushing boundaries and outsmarting the system. The same qualities that made him powerful also made him volatile. It wasn't enough for him to command respect. He wanted to defy everything and everyone that sought to confine him. As the 1980s began, Norris's name was already circulating among prison investigators as a leader of interest within the Aryan Brotherhood. His reputation for manipulation and sheer nerve made him a threat to both rival inmates and the administration. He was the kind of man who could turn a single-cell block into a war zone with a few whispered words. But he wasn't content to rule from behind bars. He wanted to test the limits of his control, to see if he could outwit the very system that held him. That hunger for control and his willingness to risk everything would soon lead to one of the most audacious and bizarre acts in California jail history. An event that would make Wendell "Blue" Norris a legend among convicts and a nightmare for corrections officials. In 1983, as his reputation reached new heights, Norris would make his first attempt to defy the unbreakable walls of incarceration, not just with words, but with an act so shocking, so grotesque, that it would cement his place in the violent mythology of America's prison underworld. The man who had built his power through fear was about to prove that there were no limits to what he would do to challenge authority. The same loyalty that had earned him respect would drive him into madness, setting in motion a series of events that would define the rest of his life. The world would soon learn that Wendell "Blue" Norris was not simply another convict. He was a man consumed by the very violence that gave him purpose. By 1983, Wendell "Blue" Norris had established himself as one of the Aryan Brotherhood's most volatile but respected figures inside California's correctional system. He had learned how to command fear without shouting, how to manipulate men without seeming to move a muscle. Yet for all his influence, there remained one truth that gnawed at him. He was still a prisoner. The walls, the guards, the endless confinement, they were insults to his pride. To a man like Norris, control meant everything. And inside a cell, control was always slipping away. It was that hunger for power, that refusal to be contained, that sparked one of the most astonishing escape attempts ever recorded in the California penal system. While housed at the Solano County Jail, Norris began quietly crafting a plan that would defy all logic and security protocols. Somehow, he had managed to acquire a small handgun, how or from whom remains a mystery. And in one of the most bizarre displays of commitment ever documented, he smuggled it into the jail hidden inside his own body. It was an act of grim ingenuity and sheer willpower. The risk of internal injury or death didn't matter. What mattered was the statement it made. Wendell "Blue" Norris was not a man who played by anyone's rules, not even nature's. The escape attempt didn't succeed. He was caught, restrained, and thrown into even deeper isolation. But among the Aryan Brotherhood, failure wasn't the point, intention was. The act alone was proof of his audacity, a display of defiance so extreme that it elevated his standing within the prison's brutal hierarchy. In the Brotherhood's code, a man who showed no fear of pain or consequence was a man to be followed. And in smuggling that gun, Norris had shown the ultimate contempt for the system that caged him. Even though he never made it out, he had already escaped in spirit. After the failed escape, prison officials labeled him one of the most dangerous inmates in custody. Every transfer, every movement was accompanied by special security measures. But the confinement only seemed to feed his rage. To Norris, being locked down was proof that he had gotten under their skin, that he had become an obsession for the same system he despised. And so he leaned into that notoriety, wearing his infamy like armor. Yet behind the defiance was a man slowly losing touch with reason, consumed by a need to push boundaries just to feel alive. That need found its most violent outlet 2 years later. In 1985, Wendell Norris's name once again splashed across headlines, this time for a crime so reckless and confrontational that it bordered on suicidal. He was convicted of kidnapping for the purpose of extortion after taking police officers hostage. The details of the case read like something out of a crime thriller. Armed, desperate, and determined to escape, Norris held the officers at gunpoint, demanding that they drive him to a safe location. He promised to kill them if they resisted. The standoff ended in his capture, but not before he made his point clear. No one, not even law enforcement, could claim power over him. That incident revealed something deeper than criminal desperation. It showed a man who had fully embraced his own mythology. Norris had begun to see himself not as a victim of the system, but as its eternal rival. Every act of defiance became part of his identity, a declaration that he would rather die fighting than live as a compliant inmate. It was a philosophy shared by the Aryan Brotherhood itself, an organization that saw rebellion as sacred and death as honorable. To them, blue was living proof that their creed still meant something. The 1985 conviction only solidified his place in the Brotherhood's leadership circle. By now, he had transitioned from an enforcer to a tactician, involved in coordinating communication between imprisoned members and their allies on the outside. The Brotherhood had long since evolved beyond a simple prison gang. It was an empire built on drugs, extortion, and murder-for-hire schemes. From solitary cells, members issued orders that reached city streets, coordinating operations through coded messages smuggled in letters and visits. Norris was part of that machinery, one of the men who kept the gears turning. Then, in 1988, his name surfaced in a case that would expose just how dangerous that machinery had become. During a California trial, a former Brotherhood member testified under oath that Norris had ordered him to gather the names of correctional officers working at Folsom Prison. It was a murder plot, cold, methodical, and terrifying in its intent. According to testimony, Norris had instructed the member to have a girlfriend of another Aryan Brotherhood associate who worked for the state, use her access to run the guards' names through a computer. The plan was to identify them, find their home addresses, and send that information to Brotherhood soldiers outside prison walls. Those men would carry out assassinations, revenge killings, meant to send a message that no one was beyond the gang's reach. The plot was discovered before any attacks occurred, but its exposure sent shockwaves through the California Department of Corrections. It was evidence of how far the Brotherhood's influence extended beyond the prison gates. To officials, it was an alarming revelation. To the Brotherhood, it was proof of power. For Norris, it was confirmation of his authority. From within a cell, he had orchestrated a plan that nearly pierced the walls of the state itself. Even when confined, he remained dangerous. Behind the violence and bravado, however, A darker transformation was taking place. Norris had always been driven by control, but the years of confinement, betrayal, and blood had begun to corrode his mind. The Brotherhood demanded absolute loyalty, but it offered no peace. Each act of brutality only tightened the psychological chains around its members. To stay alive in that world, one had to constantly prove loyalty through action, through blood, through madness. Norris was proving it over and over again, but at the cost of his sanity. The late 1980s marked the height of his influence and the beginning of his unraveling. Within the Brotherhood's ranks, whispers of distrust and paranoia began to spread. Men who once fought side by side started to suspect one another of cooperation with authorities. Drug debts and internal rivalries turned brothers into executioners. Norris, who had once wielded authority with certainty, was now surrounded by ghosts, both real and imagined. Still, he clung to the only thing that gave his life meaning: the Brotherhood's code. In his mind, everything he had done, the smuggling, the violence, the plotting, had been in service of that code. He was loyal to the end, even as that loyalty began to twist into self-destruction. The same organization that had made him a legend was slowly preparing to devour him. And as the years pressed forward, Wendell Blue Norris's story would take an even darker turn. The system that had tried and failed to contain him would soon watch as he turned his violence inward. The man who once tried to escape his cage by smuggling death inside himself would again use his body as a message, a gruesome testament to what happens when loyalty becomes a curse. By the 1990s, the California prison system had evolved into a war zone where gang politics ruled the yards and paranoia filled every cell. The Aryan Brotherhood was no longer just a group of white inmates bound by racism and violence. It had become a criminal syndicate operating within the walls of America's most secure institutions. Its members controlled drug trades, ordered killings, and maintained a network that spanned from Pelican Bay to Leavenworth. For decades, the Brotherhood thrived by enforcing its own brand of justice, swift, brutal, and absolute. But inside that empire, men like Wendell Blue Norris were starting to crack under the weight of their own legend. After years of confinement and violence, Norris had become a symbol of both power and decay within the gang. Prison officials placed him in isolation to reduce his influence, locking him away in a concrete cell for 23 hours a day. In those conditions, where silence screamed louder than any riot, his mind began to fracture. The solitude that was meant to contain him instead intensified his demons. He started to believe that unseen forces were moving against him, that his brothers were whispering in shadows, plotting his death. In the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, paranoia wasn't delusion, it was survival. And in that world, paranoia always found its proof. By then, the Brotherhood was under immense pressure. Federal authorities were launching sweeping RICO prosecutions, locking down high-ranking members for life, and dismantling communication lines. Every letter was intercepted, every coded message scrutinized. The walls were closing in, and suspicion became the air that everyone breathed. Loyalty, once sacred, was constantly being tested. If a man hesitated, if he spoke to the wrong guard or looked too long at an investigator, he was marked for death. It didn't matter how many years he'd served or how much blood he'd spilled. Trust was a currency that expired fast. For Norris, that reality turned inward. Whispers reached him that he had fallen into debt over drugs, a grave offense in the Brotherhood's economy. A member who owed money and failed to pay wasn't just seen as unreliable. He was seen as a liability, and liabilities were erased. Whether the rumors were true or not didn't matter. In the world Norris had helped create, perception was everything, and perception alone could kill a man. Inside his isolation cell, the pressure built like a slow explosion. He knew the rules. If his brothers believed he had broken the code, his death was certain. The same organization he had defended for decades, the Brotherhood he had mutilated and killed for, was now preparing to do what it always did: eliminate the weak link. But Wendell "Blue" Norris refused to give them the satisfaction. In 2007, after more than 2 decades behind bars, Norris made a decision that shocked even the most hardened correctional officers. Facing what he believed was an inevitable death sentence from his own brothers, he took matters into his own hands. With a homemade knife, crafted from sharpened metal scavenged from his cell, he turned the blade inward and disemboweled himself. It was not a quick or impulsive act. It was deliberate, ritualistic, and steeped in the warped logic of the Aryan Brotherhood's code. According to reports later published by Police magazine, Norris believed that by killing himself, he was saving his AB brothers from having to murder him. It was his final gesture of loyalty, his last offering to the gang that had already taken everything else from him. In that single act of horror, he sought to prove that even in madness, he would die by the code, not betray it. When guards discovered him, the scene was a nightmare of blood and silence. Norris had laid himself open, intestines spilling onto the cold concrete, the weapon still within reach. Somehow, he was still alive when they found him. Medical staff rushed to his aid. Stunned that anyone could endure such agony by choice, he was rushed to treatment, his life barely clinging to the edge. Those who saw the aftermath would never forget it. To them, it was the most grotesque display of devotion they had ever witnessed inside a prison. For investigators, the incident was the culmination of everything the Brotherhood represented: loyalty twisted into insanity, identity consumed by violence. Norris wasn't just another violent inmate. He was the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy, taken to its most extreme conclusion. He had lived by the sword, defied the law, challenged authority, and finally destroyed himself in the name of loyalty. To the Brotherhood, Norris's self-inflicted destruction was both a tragedy and a testament. Among members, his act was retold as a kind of dark martyrdom. He hadn't betrayed his brothers or turned informant. He had proven, in the most literal way possible, that his allegiance was absolute. He had chosen to end his life rather than allow another brother to violate the sacred code by killing him. In the culture of the Aryan Brotherhood that made him pure, a man who had paid his debts in blood. But to those outside the gang, his act was something else entirely. It was the visible end of a long psychological collapse, a symbol of what the Brotherhood's ideology did to its own. Years of isolation, indoctrination, and violence had hollowed him out until there was nothing left but the code itself. Norris had become the perfect product of the Aryan Brotherhood, a man stripped of fear, compassion, and self-preservation. And in that perfection, he found his death. When the story of his self-disembowelment circulated through the California prison system, even hardened inmates were disturbed. Some called him crazy. Others called him a soldier. For the guards who had spent years trying to manage men like him, Norris's end was both shocking and predictable. They had seen what the Brotherhood could do to a man's mind, how years of violence and confinement could twist loyalty into something monstrous. Wendell "Blue" Norris had spent his life proving he was unbreakable. But in the end, it wasn't the guards, the walls, or even his enemies who destroyed him. It was the code he lived by. The same loyalty that had made him powerful had also made him expendable. The same courage that had earned him respect had driven him to madness. And as he lay in a pool of his own blood, he completed the cycle that every member of the Aryan Brotherhood eventually faces. Live by the blade, die by it, whether by another's hand or by your own. When word of Wendell Blue, Norris's self-destruction, spread across California's prison yards, it traveled not as gossip, but as a story whispered with awe, disgust, and a strange kind of reverence. Among the Aryan Brotherhood, it became a parable, a final act of loyalty so extreme that it transcended fear. To the guards, psychologists, and investigators who had tracked his violent life for decades, it was something else entirely. Norris's end wasn't an act of courage. It was a vivid example of what years of confinement, indoctrination, and devotion to a murderous ideology could do to the human mind. He had lived and died as proof that in the Aryan Brotherhood, loyalty and insanity were often the same thing. The Brotherhood did not officially mourn him. There were no memorials, no tributes, no commemorations. In their world, death was just another transaction. A man either fulfilled his duty to the code or he didn't. Norris had fulfilled it in the most grotesque way imaginable. But inside those concrete walls, stories of his act began to grow. Younger white inmates, eager to earn respect, spoke of him as a soldier who chose pain over betrayal. For them, he was a ghost of legend, a man who refused to break even when faced with his own destruction. The myth of Blue lived on because it perfectly captured the madness of the world they lived in. For prison officials, however, the story became a case study. It revealed not only the horrifying grip the Brotherhood had on its members, but also the mental toll of life spent under its rule. Norris's final act was not born from loyalty alone. It was the product of isolation, psychological decay, and years of living within an ideology that replaced identity with obedience. By the time he turned the blade on himself, Wendell Norris no longer existed as an individual. He was merely a vessel for the gang's code, a body moved by orders, fear, and pride. When the California Department of Corrections used his story as a warning to staff and new recruits, an example of what the Brotherhood's culture of violence could breed. They spoke of his 1983 escape attempt, when he risked his life to smuggle a gun inside his own body. They referenced his 1985 kidnapping of police officers, his involvement in the 1988 murder plot against guards, and finally, his self-inflicted mutilation. Each act was a piece of the same twisted puzzle, a man who constantly challenged the system, yet was ultimately destroyed by the rules of his own making. To those who studied organized prison gangs, Norris's life represented a terrifying truth. The Aryan Brotherhood's power was not just physical, it was psychological. It reshaped men from the inside out. It demanded absolute devotion and rewarded brutality. For those who entered, there were only two exits, death or madness. Norris's story showed both. His final years were not of rebellion or control, but of surrender to an ideology that devoured him whole. As time passed, the legend of Blue began to fade from public attention. The Brotherhood continued to evolve, expanding its reach beyond California and into federal prisons across the nation. New leaders emerged, new plots unfolded, and the cycle of violence continued. But within the old-timers, the men who had survived the blood-soaked decades of the 1970s and 1980s, Norris's name remained a dark reminder of the cost of the life they had chosen. To those who knew him personally, Wendell Norris was not a hero. He was a warning. He had shown them where absolute loyalty leads when stripped of reason and humanity. His end forced even the hardest inmates to confront a question they rarely voiced aloud. How far would they go for the Brotherhood? Could they too one day find themselves alone in a cell, facing the same choice, betrayal or self-destruction? For many, the answer was already written in blood. Outside prison walls, Norris's story became part of the growing body of research into the psychology of gang loyalty. Criminologists examined his case to understand how groups like the Aryan Brotherhood maintained control through fear and ritual. They found that extreme acts of devotion, like Norris's self-mutilation, were not isolated events, but symptoms of deeper psychological manipulation. Members were taught that pain was proof of worth and that death was the only way to preserve honor. Norris had simply taken those lessons to their inevitable conclusion. In the mythology of the prison world, Wendell "Blue" Norris achieved the immortality he sought. His life became a tale retold in hushed tones, half warning, half legend. But beyond the myth lies a deeper tragedy. A man so consumed by his own beliefs that he ceased to exist outside of them. He had been a son, perhaps a brother, possibly a father before prison. But those identities were erased long ago. What remained was only Blue, the enforcer, the plotter, the believer who died for a code that gave him nothing in return. His death, and the years of violence that preceded it, remind us of the human cost behind the stories of prison gangs and their power. Behind every act of cruelty is a person hollowed out by a system that thrives on hate and hierarchy. Wendell Norris was both villain and victim, a man destroyed by the very ideology he served. His loyalty, once his pride, became his executioner. In the end, the tale of Wendell "Blue" Norris is not about heroism or defiance. It's about the corrosion of the soul under the weight of blind devotion. His name remains carved into the dark archives of America's most dangerous prisons, not as a champion of the Brotherhood, but as its most tragic disciple. And as the years pass, his story continues to echo through the corridors of California's prisons, a warning whispered to those who still believe the code is worth dying for. Be careful what you pledge your life to, because one day it may demand your death.